Let's bring in Sky News contributor and podcast host, Jane Marwick from Perth. Well, from the Free State of WA, Jane, you give me hope every single week that we're going to see the end of this, although we're now looking at stage 4. I've got to ask you, you're not in this bubble that we're in Melbourne, this lockdown, I think, where things feel pretty grim. Do you think Victoria needs a stage 4 lockdown to break the back of this? You've watched these numbers increase. We were supposed to, at this point, 3 and a bit weeks in, to have seen a significant downturn. We know the incubation period's about 14 days before we see some sorts of results. We're not. They're actually going worse. What do you think the Premier should do now?
Well, I don't know. It seems to me, Peter, that one of the problems that the Premier has, apart from the obvious, the contact tracing, when you look at countries like Taiwan and how they have been so successful, they were red hot on people and their contact tracing has been very, very effective. It seems to me that for a lot of people, they're simply not paying any attention to what the Premier says. When you look at those figures, and around a quarter of people who are called on who are at home, meant to be self-isolating because they're COVID positive and they are not at home, what does that tell you? It tells you that... Well, firstly, we know the messages from the government have been garbled and, again, mismanaged and contradictory. But secondly, they're not taking this seriously. And I would say that you could trace that back to the Premier and his approach to the Black Lives Matter protests. And I'd still like to know how much COVID spread after the Black Lives Matter protests. If only Victoria were as effective as New South Wales with that genomic testing, where they can tell you pretty much immediately where that's come from. So it shows me that because of the hotel quarantine bungling with the security guards, cedar meets, Black Lives Matter, all those sorts of things, I think people have lost faith in the government. So, I mean, I wouldn't blame Victorians if they wanted a higher power.
I don't understand where the consequences are when door gets knocked on, you're meant to be home, and a quarter of Victorians are not. Surely they get picked up, put in the back of a van and taken to a hotel that is hotel-based quarantining with police there, not the bouncers, as a consequence for not doing the right thing when they're positive. Isn't that the only way you can deal with it? Why would you just, as we saw yesterday by the Premier saying that, one of their excuses is that they need to get groceries, and he sends the army out to get people's groceries rather than a fair income, a tough consequence.
Yeah, I found that extraordinary. The other thing I've noticed is that he's gone from keeping you all locked down too hard when everyone else was getting some freedoms before, we saw the return traveller debacle and the security guards, and he was quite draconian and blaming the people of Melbourne a lot and then yesterday that press conference I thought was really odd, because he's gone from blaming people when your lockdown was too strict to not blaming people who have COVID-19 who are going out into the community. I mean, those people who are locked up in those residential towers, some of them couldn't get food for 12, 24 hours, and they couldn't get the right food. Now he doesn't mind. He's not really angry that people are leaving their homes to get food and then sending the army out. It's messy. Yeah, it is.
It's the inconsistency with messaging. And I remember back, very different circumstance, but not entirely dissimilar in terms of messaging. Sending messages back to people smugglers had to be very consistent, repeated and clear. They had to know you mean business. I don't think Victorians feel he means business anymore.
No.
His messages are mixed. I think they're not taking him seriously and they're getting away with it, and that will only grow. I've got to ask about masks too. We're all wearing masks here in Victoria, not just Melbourne now, regional Victoria as well. Fair amount of debate in Sydney this week. Should they start to wear masks? We know places like Woolies are saying we want you to have masks when you walk in the store. I went back to Facebook, asked the question, should masks be worn outside of Victoria? Kristen says, I agree to wear them inside areas. I think she means they're inside a building or something. But we need to breathe in oxygen, and we aren't doing it with a mask on the outside. Tones Oz believes masks should be mandatory for all of Australia. Coronavirus doesn't believe in magical state borders. Tracy Falk-Hill thinks, yes, why shouldn't they? Why aren't they? They aren't doing any harm and can certainly be helpful. Jane, what do you think?
Yeah, look, I think we're watching those numbers in Sydney creeping up. I would understand if the Premier in New South Wales at least urged people to wear masks, whether or not they become mandatory. I think when you start to see those numbers creep up, here in Western Australia we had one new case today. I think it'd be a hard case to make. However, look, the politicians were slow. The World Health Organisation was slow on masks, Peter. Then politicians were slow. I remember you and I talking about this a couple of weeks ago. I said if politicians want the general public to wear masks, they have to start wearing them. Well, I think it took them about 5 or 6 days to start putting those masks on. So lead by example. If you want people to wear masks, lead by example. I think New South Wales might be looking at mandatory masks if those numbers keep creeping up. I can understand in SA, the NT, Tasmania, no. But if the numbers start creeping up or coming up, absolutely yes, and no problem with it. People should not be. I mean, look at those numbers in Victoria. The numbers of people who are out refusing to wear masks and being fined. For goodness sake, just wear the mask.
I know I'm going to get the Husqvarna out on the weekend and make some masks for the nieces and nephew. I might even have them to show you next week on the show. Let's see if my needlework's tidy enough to put it on air. Aged care, let's talk about aged care. 928 cases. They are the most vulnerable. We've known this from the get-go. We watched, particularly in the United Kingdom, what happened overseas. I just can't fathom knowing what we knew, seeing what we saw, watching these cases start to escalate, knowing there was leakage out of hotel quarantine, why we weren't more prepared or why more wasn't done to protect our most vulnerable.
Look, this infuriates me. And when you look at those numbers, Peter, where they discover that 1 in 4, when they looked at every staff member on duty, they had 13 to 14 patients to deal with. We knew these people were vulnerable. Look at Newmarch House. It's like what we saw with New South Wales and the Ruby Princess. Learn from those early mistakes. These people have worked hard for our country. They've been taxpayers. Just because they're quiet in an old people's homes doesn't mean they should have been ignored. I think this is the greatest travesty and tragedy. The stories out of St Basil's and other homes in Victoria are tragic. And really and truly, when it comes to a Royal Commission and they're looking at hotel security, I mean, we should have the Royal Commission, I agree with you, and they should call it before everything gets shredded. They also need a big inquiry into aged care. It is an absolute disgrace.
I agree with you. Hey, now I've got to give you a bit of credit here. That book, Harry and Meghan, it's about to be released. They say it's a tell-all tale, all the insides of the carry-on before they left the royal family. A while back, you and I were talking about that rumour of Meghan throwing a bit of a tantrum over not getting the tiara of her choice for the wedding. I said at the time, I think, oh, that's all gossip, that's rubbish, blah, blah, blah. But the book seems to confirm that there was a row with the Queen making it very clear that she will decide what the tiara is that she lends, that the borrower, Meghan, doesn't get to choose. Well, you were right.
Yeah, I think we're seeing Meghan's true colours coming out. This book, I mean, we're getting the excerpts. It tells us that she emboldened Harry. I think that tiara probably actually went to Eugenie. That emerald tiara is the one that she wore for her wedding. And good on her, she's turned out to be a better royal than Meghan. I think we're seeing Meghan's true form coming through, and just that sense of entitlement. She didn't want to play number 2 to Kate or number 3. We're seeing it all come out now. I think the royal family's better off without those two.
Yeah, but it's like she married into the royal family. Well, and Harry grew up in the royal family and suddenly realised there's a pecking order. I mean, the whole bloody premise of the royal family is that there is a pecking order. Goodness
yeah,
me.
but Diana had always said that was a problem for Harry, hadn't she? She'd always said she worried about Harry. Harry didn't like playing second fiddle either. They're better off over there in the United States, Peter.
Yeah, timing is everything. It's a great time to leave and try and start a new career in the middle of a coronavirus. No one's really interested in. We've all moved on. Jane, as always, thanks for your time. And everyone, go to Jane's iPod podcast place, the Jane Marwick Show, and grab a good dose of common sense from Jane Marwick. All right, see you next week, Jane.